Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. A warm welcome to the global learning event, Economic Inclusion for the Poorest, Moving to Scale, and the session today on how to leverage economic inclusion for a more green, resilient, and inclusive economy. My name is Bodewig. I work on social protection in West Africa, in the Sahel region for the World Bank, and we do a lot of work on economic inclusion in that place. As this is a global learning event, we wanted to start out by taking a picture of who's in the room, or rather, where you're calling in from. So we're going to have a Zoom poll that is going to come up, where you have to click and to say where you're calling in from. You see the major regions of the world, and you should click and submit. And then we will see, how global we are today. I'm going to give it a little moment. And then we should see the results popping up very shortly. Okay, we are global except South Asia, but we do have strong participation from North America, which is where many of us sit, myself included, from Europe, from Latin America, and also from Africa. Great, so good to see how global we are this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. Before we get into the conversation, I wanted to share some housekeeping issues. And some of you who've been in some of the sessions, you already know this, but so I'll be quick. Interpretation is available into English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. You just have to click on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and select the language. You must select a language, even if you choose to select English like I did. If you have any connection issues or trouble with the language selection, let us know in the chat box, and we will assist you. The chat box is always monitored. You can also use the chat box to participate in the conversation and share your questions. We will have ample time at the end for question and answer. You don't have to wait until the end to put in your questions. We are monitoring it all the time. It's important for us to make this interactive. If you want to, you can change your Zoom view so that you only see our speakers and the moderator. It's really up to you. If you want to do this, there's a top right on your screen, the three dots, and you can choose the speaker view. Lastly, if you have any information, articles, research that you'd like to share on the topic of discussion today, please email it to us at peimt@worldbank.org. So to get into the substance of the conversation, a little bit of a framing up front. As we all know, the world is facing a dual crisis of pretty large proportions, COVID and climate change. And while we're contemplating a recovery from the pandemic, there is increasing consensus that this recovery ought to be green, resilient, and inclusive to tackle poverty and deepening inequality, both from the COVID-19 shock and also at the same time, the longer-term challenge of climate change. So what role can economic inclusion play in a greener, more resilient, and more inclusive economy? On the face of it, economic inclusion programs score pretty well on inclusion because they're focused on the poor. They're also programs of choice, if you'd like, by helping households and communities develop and diversify, sustain livelihoods. But how can they deliver on the green objective? Or rather, how can they align green, resilient, and inclusive objectives? How can they deliver on climate action? This is what we're trying to get at in this session today. We recognize that it's perhaps a little less developed area of work compared to some of the other dimensions of economic inclusion, but it's one that will become only more central in the coming decade. So it's time to look at this and to begin to think about this in a more structured way. And we're trying to use this session to kind of give some direction. To kick us off, we want to engage you as the audience through yet another poll. It'll be the last poll for today, but just to kind of get us started and get your views on the primary use of economic inclusion in climate action. We'll be using menti.com, which is a tool that we've been using throughout the event to engage the audience. So either on your phone, your tablet, or in a new browser window, you should log into www.menti.com and type the code and as it's being displayed. There we go. So the question is, where lies the biggest potential of economic inclusion programs in climate action? And the question is really, is it more geared towards adaptation, helping households adapt and communities adapt to the impacts of climate change, or is it more to promote greener practices to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and generally more greener practices, or is it both? So what we're seeing here is, and we'll let that stand for a second. What we're seeing here is the fact that perhaps the most immediate obvious role that economic inclusion programs can play is on the adaptation side, helping households and communities adapt. But it's now actually interesting to see that the both is picking up, and that there's a reflection that yes, perhaps economic inclusion programs do have a role to play in promoting both an adaptation agenda and a mitigation agenda. We will keep it going for a little bit, but I think the message that from this this poll is pretty clear, that we're leaning towards both objectives being at the core of economic inclusion programs. And that's actually a nice framing for our discussion with our experts today, who join us from different parts of the world as well, with unique experiences working on the space of green, resilient, and inclusive development. We have Tracy Hart, who is the global lead for fragile and conflict states for the environment, natural resources, and blue economy global practice at the World Bank. We have Omar Benammour, who is a social protection officer in the FAO's Inclusive Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division. And we have Jorge Maldonado, who is a full professor at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, and also the coordinator of the platform of evaluation and learning of graduation programs in Latin America. So in turning to our experts for a first round of question, the first question I'd like to pose is, from your perspective and based on your experiences, how do you see economic inclusion programs, and how can they promote the transition towards a greener, more resilient, and more inclusive economy? And it would be great to get a little bit of a sense of your own motivation, inspiration, and experience working in the space in general, and how you got to focus on this topic. Let's begin with you, Jorge. Over to you. Jorge, we need to
Christian, can you hear me now?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the invitation, and hi to everyone that is joining this session. As Christian was saying, I am director of the Platform of Evaluation and Learning of Graduation Programs in Latin America. This is an initiative led by IDRC, Ford Foundation, and Fundación Capital, with the idea of evaluating programs in Latin America that are led by the governments. For doing that, we have done evaluations in Honduras, Paraguay, Colombia, and Mexico. And in all of the cases, trying to combine qualitative and quantitative approaches to get a good sense of what is going on with this program, with this approach of the graduation programs. In general terms, we have observed positive effects on assets formation, on income in some cases, on savings, and in soft skills. However, what is also a common pattern is to realize that participants are exposed to extreme climatic conditions. We have observed droughts, floods, landslides that create loss of crops, livestock, assets, and as it happened in the recent case of Honduras, as you might have heard, in Honduras, there was a strike of two consecutive hurricanes, Eta and Iota, and it created not only a strong loss of assets, but also a loss of roads and bridges, creating more isolation for the communities. So we recognize that this is a reality, and now climate change is here to exacerbate this situation for all of these rural communities trying to increase their capabilities and their resilience. So what to do? Then I would like to provoke the discussion today, proposing at least 3 measurements that we can use for understanding and integrating the climate change and the environmental conditions into the inclusion, economic inclusion programs. In particular, it could be analyzed for the graduation programs, but in general for any economic inclusion programs. I have 3 ideas to discuss here today. The first one is that we can take advantage of the coaching of these economic inclusion programs to include modules in which to work on recognizing the climate risk that the households are facing and how to build resilience in terms of these risk and shocks that they can be exposed to. And also to consider how to include adaptation measures to the climate change. The second idea is to design productive activities that consider those climate change effects and that make the households prepare for facing those effects like droughts or floods or landslides that can affect them. And the third idea is related with the need of including into the programs right from the beginning insurance programs that cover the households from climate shocks. Now that we have that the climatic effects are everywhere, we have also the need of thinking on tools for solving the problems related with those effects. And the insurance program can be an option if we would like to guarantee that the households keep their well-being once the intervention has been placed on, but also for the governments that could have the opportunity of making more valuable their inversions, their investments, and to guarantee that the households in some way are not losing their effort after 12 or 18 or 2 years. So just to provoke the discussion, I was to put these 3 ideas, but also I would like to emphasize that rural areas provide not only agricultural services. We are very used to think on rural areas just as the source of food and agricultural products and livestock. But what is more important to recognize is that rural areas provide vital ecosystem services. Just to mention carbon sequestration, hydrological regulation, opportunities for tourism, different forms of tourism, ecotourism, agrotourism, beer washing, activities that can be used to involve the rural households in this type of green productive activities, and not to concentrate or not to focus in the idea of only producing agricultural products. If we can move in that direction, in this transition of including all of the ecosystem services and how to take advantage of conserving and producing these ecosystem services into the productive or economic inclusion programs, we can have programs and implementations that create more positive effects, probably a better asset formation, a more sustainable path of income, and more possibilities of having savings, and of course other skills that can make not only the household be better and be in a correct pattern out of poverty, but also to guarantee that the governments can have a better performance in their investments. I will stop there, Christian, and then we can continue on this discussion.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Very clear. So you effectively making the point that climate change is impacting the populations that economic inclusion programs are meant to serve, but at the same time, the populations that are beneficiaries of economic inclusion programs also have a major contribution to make. And you propose 3 adaptations to design or inclusions to the design of economic inclusion programs around coaching, around specific productive activities, and insurance to be able to help gear economic inclusion programs to address the issue. Thank you very much. Let me pass over to Omar, who will also share with us his approach and his view of how economic inclusion programs can address this issue. Omar, over to you.
Thanks, Christian, and hi, everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. So on my side, I will be focusing a bit more on the food systems. And the role of economic inclusion programs within food system. As you know, over the next 15 years, about 1.6 billion people will reach working age in low and middle income countries. So, and you have the fact that an important fact in this is the fact that food system already provides more jobs than any other sectors, both self and wage employment, and we expect it to remain the top employer for foreseeable future. And you have different categories within the food system. So you have farmers, you have people working on processing, distribution, transporters, but also supermarket, canteens, food stall, restaurant workers. And right now, nowadays, you have around 4.5 billion people depending on the food system for their jobs and livelihoods. And there's a major overlap with the fact that majority of the extreme poor live in rural areas. For example, in West Africa, the food system accounts for 66% of total employment. And as per capita incomes increase, eating patterns shift, the demand for jobs in this off-farm segment of the food system increases. But at the same time, food systems contribute and are impacted by climate change. Food systems are the major source of greenhouse gas emissions, around 25 to 30%. And you have also the fact that food system can overuse natural resources and put at risk biodiversity. You have also to take into account that food systems do not facilitate access always to healthy diets and may promote obesity and malnutrition. At the same time, when we talk about jobs and livelihood within the food system, we're talking about generally precarious and at-risk jobs that are not always inclusive of the poorest. And in the context of COVID-19, we know that food systems have suffered quite a lot, and 35% of the food system employment were at risk or are at risk. And solutions are needed to build back better. And so when we talk about the transition towards a more green, resilient, and inclusive economy, for me, it also we need to focus on a more inclusive and sustainable food system transformation. In a region like MENA and Sahel, this debate is even more relevant as common challenges related to large youth unemployment, conflict and political instability, desertification and limited access to resources, water scarcity, land, and regular food crisis in Sahel and increasing food insecurity in MENA are an important dimension to take into account when we talk about the transition towards a more inclusive and sustainable economy. So what is the role of economic inclusion program in the sustainable and inclusive food system transformation? In many countries, the level of inclusivity of food system is generally insufficient, and there's nothing inherently inclusive and sustainable about food systems transformation. The food system may be transformed on the back of the rural poor if strong adjustments are not made. So conclusion is the fact that we need economic inclusion programs for promoting a more inclusive and sustainable food systems. However, economic inclusion programs for income growth can present also important trade-offs if dependent on environmentally unsustainable practices or on the promotion of unhealthy diets, while protection of the environment and nutrition positive practices could mean also in the short or long term a loss of income for some. So economic inclusion processes need to take into account this trade-off to ensure that they are minimized as possible. And in that, social protection is a key aspect to facilitate this transition as an enabler, enhancer of income strategies, but also as a human right and an essential risk management strategy. So how economic inclusion program can promote a sustainable and inclusive food system transformation? I can mention three paths. One is a classic one, the agriculture path. Now, economic inclusion will help to intensify sustainably, inclusively production and sale. So by doing so, economic inclusion programs can increase the capacities of small-scale farmers to produce affordably healthy food, and by supporting the adoption of climate-smart practices, pushing forward agroecology-centered approach and long-term climate adaptation programs. And for this, we can talk about cash plus. But those type of interventions should absolutely be associated to high potential local value chains linked to market opportunities or institutional procurement possibilities, such as home school feeding, for example. But they need also to promote eventually, and we've seen this in the response to COVID, shorter value chain to reduce power imbalances. They should also facilitate access to social security, improve work conditions, reduce informality in the sector, and support access to agriculture insurance for sustainably impact the livelihood of rural households. I can give one example, but maybe we will do this in the discussion. But just I would focus on the other paths. The diversification path is the second one. So economic inclusion can also generate income from agriculture and natural resource management, as well as from non-agriculture related activities, and also within the food systems, actually, transformation. Economic inclusion programs can support the diversification of livelihood and improve natural resource management by reducing overfishing, overusing of forest, of land and water, for example, by facilitating transition to alternative source of income or jobs through the promotion of sustainable agri-food value chains that require specific skills. And I can give you an example of the promotion of aquaculture as an alternative to small-scale fisheries, for example. But also by focusing and developing some key opportunities, such as in processing, marketing, transport, as well as in non-agricultural sectors, such as tourism, pescatourism, for example. And this you can do it through the promotion of cash plus intervention, green jobs, labor market intervention, public works, etc. And the last path for this is also the innovation, what I call the innovation path, which is basically the fact that economic inclusion programs can help in providing job opportunities and facilitate access to new technologies in alignment to the adjustment that is needed in food system, in particular in crises such as COVID. Because we've seen like a lot of new job opportunities where food system has been adapted to COVID. For example, we have seen some shorter value chain and more job opportunities in transporting, delivery of food, for example. So this is one aspect that also should be considered, and that was very key in the Mediterranean region on the fishery sector, for example. So a key consideration that I would like to highlight here to finalize my presentation is the fact that social protection has a key role to play in the current crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic. But the social protection role in promoting economic inclusion has not been promoted as such, not enough. So, and the key element of economic programs are social protection intervention, cash transfers intervention. And without those, and with a very limited coverage and poor targeting, especially in Sahel and the MENA region, I think we may face a limitation here. Additionally to this, sustainable and inclusive economic transitions through food system transformation requires to adjust the economic inclusion programs to the needed change in food system, according to the limitation in terms of environment and social dimension. So economic inclusion programs cannot be in standalone programs anymore, and scale-up requires to be integrated into a more systemic approach based on food system assessment and rural multidimensional poverty assessments. Also, it has to be aligned and linked to investment in infrastructures, for example. And we also should use economic inclusion programs to build a strong social contract as a virtual circle for concrete benefits, collection of taxes, formalization of the new jobs that are created. And the last point is, and focusing on MENA and the Sahel region, I think it's really important to focus on the youth, on the women, on off-farm job opportunities, on the promotion of climate adaptation, intervention, and sustainable practices, but also on building capacities of the government for having more integrated and coordination mechanism and policies. And last point as well, just to conclude, is the fact that we need also to regularly monitor and evaluate those economic inclusion programs to understand also their potential positive impact on food system transformation, but also their negative impact eventually on child labor, and consider just to understand a bit more also their trade-off between sectors, between geographic areas. Yeah, and that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Omar. That was a very rich contribution, and I very much like that you focuses on food systems which are critical in the countries in which economic inclusion programs are prominent, and I like very much the conceptual breakdown into the three areas, focusing on more traditionally on agriculture, but also to highlight the diversification, which in itself is central to greater resilience to the impacts of climate change, the diversification of livelihoods, and we see that very strongly in the Sahel region, and to highlight the innovation that is needed, but also that programs can bring, and the need to anchor that in a systematic approach to systems. Let me pass it over to Tracy and get your perspectives on this from the environmental side. I mean, we've heard the view of a researcher. We've heard the view of someone who looks at it from the social protection food system side. You're seeing it from the environmental side. So be very interested in your perspectives. Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Christian. So it's true, I've been working in the environment and natural resource arena in fragile and conflict states for the past 35 years. Here are some of the types of projects that we work on in terms of social and economic inclusion, community terracing, sustainable fisheries production, urban solid waste management, drainage and flood prevention, and tree nurseries and planting for afforestation, among others. A few points that I'd like to make is that the poorest often have most of their assets tied up in natural resources, whether they be land assets, access to water assets, seeds, stored grains, trees, or tools or other equipment related to natural resource asset management. That's one thing. And so we in the environment practice approach this from the physical environment often. What does the physical environment look like? How is it degraded? How could those natural resource assets be used better? And what social protection programs bring to the equation is the element of identifying the poorest and how one effectively targets them. So the human capital side of the equation. And often I've worked in regions where we have social protection and CDD, community-driven development programs rooted in the environment sector working in parallel, where we have complementaries to bring to bear that we're not fully taking advantage of. So, I mean, that's one point I'd like to drive home. You know, I see that in terms of our environment and natural resource practices, that we don't do targeting well. We do targeting in terms of where are the most marginally productive or unproductive spaces. And so we do that kind of geographical targeting. A few issues that, so I spend a lot of time at the kind of the nexus between natural resource management, conflict, and migration, climate-induced migration. And you know, there's two types of climate events: your slow onset climate events and your rapid onset climate events. Slow onset climate events are like the desertification occurring across the length of the Sahel, from Mauritania and Senegal over to Djibouti and Somalia on the East Coast. Rapid onset climate events are increasing numbers of tsunamis, floods, earthquakes, landslides, etc. And so when it comes to either trying to anticipate or to mitigate these climate events, what the role of social protection or economic inclusion programs brings to us is how does, what is the composition of assets of the poorest, and how do the poorest react to changes in their assets, their non-cash as well as their cash assets, and how therefore might they react to a infusion of assistance with regards to targeted cash programs or cash for work programs, or non-cash natural resource based economic inclusion programs. That's really the role that and the gain that we have from my work to working alongside those in social protection who are more directly concerned with economic inclusion. So, you know, with respect to, and let me make a few more points. With respect to the role of remittances, you know, remittances provide cash flows, but yet those who receive remittances often don't have the human capital knowledge to know how best to invest those remittances. And so opening up the possibilities of short-term consumption of remittances versus a mix of consumption and investment of those remittances is one area where we can work together. And possibilities of investment of those remittances can be things like solar refrigerators for you know, small commercial enterprises, solar pumps for irrigation, integrated shade, forestry, and agriculture, tree nurseries for sales to others, storage, better storage facilities to be able to cope with lean seasons and to be able to sell to others during lean seasons, et cetera. With respect to climate migration, it's really important to understand that staying in place is the preferred outcome for those who are the poorest living in marginally productive areas. And what does that mean in terms, what do those poorest need in order to be able to stay in place in terms of assets, in terms of use of those assets, in terms of management of the natural resource assets that they have? Because if they move, for those who do have land or access to water or cattle or livestock, it's very likely that they will lose those assets when they move to urban areas, and therefore the little assets that they have will be lost in the process of migration. Another point is that women are most likely to be left behind when in the first wave of migration, when men travel to urban areas or abroad to seek diversification of income, and therefore how to target women who are left behind, who are often providing for their families between when they receive remittances is really critical. Understanding how to target those women directly and understanding how they would like to receive and what they need to receive in terms of cash assistance or non-cash assets is really critical to making sure that if there are men who migrate, that we keep some sort of hold against full-fledged migration out of areas that are marginally productive. So with that said, I will turn it back to Christian, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. A strong call for greater alignment between environmental policy and social protection. And I really like your emphasis on how to deal with migration, and which is one potential disruptor of the process. So thanks a lot for this first round of reflection. I think it opened a number of leads for the discussion, and we really like to invite the audience. We're a sufficiently small but sufficiently large group of people around this virtual table to have some exchange. So keep questions coming. We're monitoring the chat box, and we can aggregate these questions together. Let me maybe start out with one question, which is really focused on the production, the agricultural production process. Well, on the one hand, there is a drive to increasing productivity of agricultural production in order to sustain an increase in living standards. But also then, there's the important challenge of increasing resilience. So how do we align how do we balance the productivity agenda and the resilience agenda? And how can economic inclusion programs, because they do focus, like Tracy said, on on individuals and on individual households and communities, how can we use these programs to strike the appropriate balance between these two objectives? Who would like to come in between the three of you? Omar, go ahead.
I could start if you want, just to give some thought. I think it's important to try to reach those two objectives at the same time. First of all, I think this is a whole aspect, and what I was talking about when I'm talking about food system transformation, I'm talking also about resilient food systems, and it's not about that much about productivity. It's about also accessing to markets, and this is also what is important. Is not about producing more, it's about producing more sustainably, or using let's say good practices in terms of environmental dimension, but also is looking at eventually considering the different aspects related to healthy diets, and I'm considering this dimension as well. So I would say it's not, there's so many things to balance at the same time. And I think we have tools, and social protection is a key tool for this, to adjust and facilitate the transition to the right, let's say, approach, and increase the access to specific tools that can help to at least improve productivity and make it more resilient. There's also the aspect related to, I didn't mention it, but shock responsive social protection as well. It's a key element that can help to improve the resilience of producers, as well as access to social security. We have the tendency to forget this, and we're focusing so much on the economic inclusion production aspect that we have the tendency to forget that once we have an active population, they need to have an access to social security and be protected in case of any types of shock. So this is, I would stop here just to give my colleagues another, thank you.
Tracy, Jorge, do you have perspectives on that you'd like to share?
Hi. Yeah, I think that Tracy has mentioned two aspects that are very important to consider here. One of them is this of migration. Now we are facing a climate-driven migration, no? Not only economic or conflict migration, but now because of the changes in the climate patterns, we have to expect that. So this is not only a problem for the own country, but also for other countries that are exposed to this one. And one example that is quite important is the case of Honduras. You have seen how people are getting out of the economic opportunities, and the response is the massive migration to the United States, trying to get better conditions for their living. No, so this is an issue that probably is gonna be part of the agenda in the following years. On the other hand, when you are mentioning the issue of social protection, I also like to bring to the table the fact that the social protection may involve direct interventions, try to support the households, but there is also a set of indirect interventions related with the provision of public goods. So in order to guarantee resilience and improvement in productivity, we have to think in how to bring electricity, roads, access to internet to those communities, so they can be better prepared to face any shock, or in order to get to be more productive and more involved into the economy. So I think this is important to put that on the table.
Thank you, Jorge. Tracy, do you want to come in on this, or should we move on? Tracy has been very active also in the chat box, so she's kind of playing on two, using two communication channels.
No, I'd like to move on, since I
okay, good.
Two terrific answers.
Very good. So I just want to make sure that no one's feeling left out. I'd like to move on to a related question and topic, which is really related to the diversification agenda. I mean, clearly diversification is central to this whole question. I mean, both, Omar, as you mentioned, through its own objective, but even within agriculture, it is an important part of the agricultural objective is around diversification. The migration question. Migration is in some sense also part of diversification of a household set of activities. And so I wanted to make to get a little bit into what Jorge said at the beginning. One of the entry points is around the coaching or the capacity building and the engaging households and communities into the how-to and what are pathways to diversification. And I wanted to get your perspectives on emerging experience and how to do this. And one thing that I'd be particularly interested in your perspective is the role of women in the diversification decision-making in households, because we're seeing in the Sahel increasingly that women are the drivers of diversification, especially of activities out of agriculture into adjacent set of activities. So how do we rethink the approach to promoting the diversification through the behavior change aspects of the design of economic inclusion programs, and with the focus on women, perhaps. Who would like to come in on this?
I mean, I can start. So
good, Tracy, over to you.
So I think that traditionally women have been the diversifiers in terms of taking agricultural products to market in local markets. And women have also been a bit of the diversifier in terms of household expenditures in being able to manage how much is spent on food versus clothing versus education. And so I think women have had their finger on the pulse of these aspects of diversification, both in expenditures and in moving out of agricultural production into marketing for as long as women have been managing household expenditures. I think the question is, where do you go from agricultural marketing in terms of diversification in rural settings? What opportunities do you have for diversification in agricultural settings? And when it comes to that, perhaps having small-scale commercial marketing that is not agricultural based, in terms of whether it's selling solar equipment or selling cold chain items like popsicles and ice and whatever. I think there's the creativity there to be able to do some of this, and yet there's not even necessarily the amount of initial capital needed, so that the entry, there's barriers to entry basically, and being able to start some of these small scale enterprises. So I think that the barriers of entry keep women out, but also keep equally women and men out from being able to move from agricultural marketing to other areas. Those are my initial thoughts. Over.
Jorge, Omar, do you have perspectives on this? Jorge, you go first and then Omar.
Okay. Well, I am thinking on two things. One of them is and is related with a question from Alejandra from Peru about the diversification and the issue of promoting, for example, handicraft made by women into the productive activities for economic inclusion. In fact, in the evaluation of the Mexican pilot, the graduation approach that we did almost 1 year ago, it was finished, we observed that in one of the communities, it was a huge promotion of handicrafts, these small dolls that you can find in Mexico City. All of them are usually made by women, and there was a huge promotion of this type of handicraft for increasing the abilities of the of the women and the income of the household, and it was very effective. However, I have to say that all of the cases should be considered case by case, because they are very context specific. In some cases, you can have good opportunities for promoting this handicraft. In other cases, you can just fool the market of this handicraft and have a choke on prices, and those issues related with the scaling up of the programs and the activities is important to consider. On the other hand, usually as Tracy mentioned, also women have to bear most of the effects of the climate shocks, and they have to increase their own activities when they are facing climate events. So if they are in charge of getting the water for the household, or getting the wood, the firewood, if there is a climate event, they have to increase their effort to get these goods for the households. So they are already paying a high price for the climatic events, and it sounds to be more challenging to think that they now have the responsibility of also solving or facing the climate events related into the household. No? You have to think on the household as a whole, and a system that allows to move all of the household into a more resilient pattern.
Omar, over to you.
Yeah, no, just few thoughts around diversification. I mean, maybe the word that we use here is maybe something that is probably problematic to me. It's probably we should talk about transition. Diversification seems a bit weak in a way that it's mostly, it gives probably like a temporary alternative for people that need actually sustainable jobs and job opportunities, and probably we need to think about this at some point. But for women, it's there's something that I had in mind is the cultural barriers. No, I think that it's one of the, I think it's in Jordan, if I'm not mistaken. I think that there's a very few or very low percentage of women that are actually working in the labor market, that are really working. So before even talking about diversification of our source of income or livelihood, we probably need to also tackle the fact that most of the women do not have access to jobs themselves. So wondering how we position this here, but so this is where I will say that, and we talk about diversification. Maybe we should not talk only about women as well. We should talk about in general workers, and have in mind also the workers in the fishery sectors that are pretty much their livelihood and their income are clearly depending on the level of natural resource management. When you overfish and you have so many competitors in the sea, your level of income and your level of economic inclusion is definitely weakened. So, and on this, I can give one example that is, I think, for me, very good. Is one example that I've seen in Malaysia, where during closing seasons, fishers, small-scale fishers, receive an unemployment benefit and a sort of a package of intervention for them to help them to diversify their source of income in other sectors, not necessarily agriculture sectors, but through training, cash, etc. So I think it's a very good example of on how we can support the transition of specific workers into different other sectors by facilitating the flexibility of labor markets. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. We have time for one more round of question, and I'd like to finish with a forward look and ask you for your sense as to both what is what are some of the, and very quickly, one kind of question per person. What is, what are the key unknowns that we need more research into? So if each one of you has kind of one up their sleeve to put it out. And then secondly, what is the, from a political economy and institutional perspective, how do you see the way forward? We're talking about big transitions. We talk about the food system transition, and one of the questions, in fact, in the chat box was, how do we make sure that that broader food system transition is reflective of the needs and the interests of the poor? There are major transitions in agriculture coming ahead. So how do we position economic inclusion programs in this mix? Because it's, different agencies in government are responsible for that. So how do we, from a political economy perspective, position this work? So what are some of what's the unknowns that we need more research in, and how to operationalize this approach for a greener, resilient, more inclusive development agenda? Tracy, do I first turn to you? Yes, I knew it. Over to you.
I'll start. So in terms of some of the unknowns, I think there are still quite a number of unknowns about how to, what the behaviors, trying to predict the behaviors of the poor with regards to infusions of cash and or cash for work programs. What happens to these infusion of resources, and how are these funds spent? Are they invested back into productive assets? Do they potentially reduce migration? Are they, and can the twinning of cash transfers with CDD type interventions kind of mutually reinforce having these cash infusions go into investments that can be economically sustainable for those poor households. Those are some of the unknowns where I think future research and more research yields benefits for those of us who are making decisions about these investments and these programs, especially in the context of scaling up. With regards to the political economy side of the equation, many countries in which I work that are under active conflict or in cyclical conflict have the exclusion of the poor in participation about how natural resources assets are managed as one of the main drivers of conflict. So for example, if you have forests being degraded by international commercial assets or by local elites, and the poor living in and around those forests are not included in the decision-making process about how to manage those forests, then that will lead to conflict. And therefore, making sure that there is an identification of not only perhaps who manages those assets, but who is living in and among those assets that does not necessarily own or manage the assets, is part of the process of identifying this economic inclusion of who needs to be at the table and who needs to benefit in some way from management of natural resource assets. And that larger political economy question is at the root of much of the natural resource degradation that's still occurring and much of the conflict that's still occurring. Over.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Let me hand it over to Omar next, and then to Jorge. with the plea to be very brief and succinct because we are running out of time. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks. I think to me, the major gaps in terms of evidence is the measurement of economic inclusion and what is sustainable economic inclusion, actually. And on this, how do we measure it? Because I think, and how do we include economic inclusion program within a food system transformation? And how do we consider the trade-off of economic inclusion in the design of those programs, especially on environmental issues, but also on inequalities at the regional level? No, like if we support economic inclusion program in one specific area, you may have a negative impact on inequalities in another area, and a negative impact on economic inclusion itself. Also looking at the potential negative impact on child labor. We talk about gender transformative approaches. I think I was listening yesterday to one of the colleagues was saying that we've seen in some countries that economic inclusion programs reduce the time of women for childcare and may have an impact potentially on the lack of education of kids. Not saying that women should take care of kids, not at all, but I'm saying that we should take into account those dimensions and see exactly what kind of solution we should be promoted. And also last thing is related to the innovation and technologies. It's both an opportunity and potentially a challenge because it can create a divide in inequalities of accessing to specific solutions. So we may talk about digital divide in some context. So I think this is one aspect that should be also considered in the future. So thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jorge, for your 1 minute parting message.
Okay, I will put together the two questions with 3 points, three short points. The first one is that we have to recognize that the familiar agriculture is different from commercial agriculture, and that the objectives of the familiar agriculture are different from those of the commercial agriculture. So we have to think on that in order to design policies and tools for familiar agriculture, which has a different objective. The second one, in terms of the political economy, is that we have to involve the ministries of agriculture in this discussion. But also the ministries of agriculture need to recognize that they are not only engaged into agriculture, but also into the rural development to guarantee a huge, a wide vision of what is going on with the rural sector. And the third one has to be with the another challenge in which we have been working is that we need to put together into the dialogue the ministries of agriculture and the ministries of development, so we can take advantage of the synergies that can emerge when rural peoples are beneficiary of social protections and rural and productive or agricultural initiatives. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Tracy, for a very rich discussion, both in the discussion and in the chat. I think there's a lot of material that we all walking away with. Thank you to the audience for active engagement. And we want to hear from you. You will now see 2 questions on your screen. Take a quick moment to let us know how you enjoyed the session. It's anonymous and the results will not be displayed. So please fill this out. So we will use material from the session going forward. This is kind of the beginning of I think a stepped up effort to engage in this space. We really value the inputs and the feedback, both through in terms of the session, the session, but also what came up in the discussion. So let me thank you very much for joining us. You will also I think see a link to the next session that's coming up that you enrolled in. But for now, I'd like to thank you all for being here. and wish you a very good rest of the day and look forward to a continuation of this discussion. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.